How is it going, everybody? Welcome to the review for the second episode of the Dinosaurs. So, this episode is completely centered around the Cretaceous period. It starts off in the early Cretaceous and then it goes into like the early part of the late Cretaceous. So, we do have some pretty cool things to talk about with this episode. It covered a lot of ground and introduced us to a lot of very interesting critters. So, let's get right into it. Now, the episode begins in early Cretaceous China, where we see a herd of sauropods and they are simply just called that. They are simply just called sauropods. We're not given an actual name, so of course we could just speculate about what sauropods these are. My money's on Liaoning Titan, but I'm not too sure. Obviously, this is where we get introduced to Tyrannus, and I've talked about it before. We already had a clip of this fella before. It's a great design. I really like the way that it looks. The coloration looks really nice. The coverage of feathers looks pretty darn good. The skull shape seems correct. It has huge arms with three large claws on each hand. It's a good design. I really like it. Now we're watching it as it stalks this herd of sauropods, and it singles out a young individual, which that is likely pretty correct. Predatory animals, even dinosaur predatory animals, would likely prioritize the weakest members of a herd if they are going to actually hunt that herd. And so a Eutyrannus going after the youngest member of a herd makes a lot of sense. It ambushes the sauropod and takes it down with relative ease, but I would say that like the surprise of being ambushed and the fact that it bit it right on its neck. And so I'd say that this was a pretty realistic depiction of a theropod hunt. I thought that they did pretty good with that. After that, we are introduced to Draco, and I really liked the way that this guy looked. The way that the beak looks, the way that the teeth looks, the crest, the feathers, everything looks phenomenal on it. I thought it was a fantastic design. And it is slowly surrounded by a group of Longipteryx. Now, this kind of continues that storyline that they had established in the Jurassic episode that dinosaurs were slowly starting to transition into the skies, like they were starting to move into that domain, essentially. It started off with the Anchiornis, with that pterosaur eating the Anchiornis, and now it's kind of like it's culminated with these Longipteryx over here. It would have been really cool if we got it established that birds, like actual true birds, were established in the Jurassic period, like towards the middle to late Jurassic, as opposed to just having them pop up in the Cretaceous period. Because, yeah, Longipteryx is a true bird, but birds did not first show up in the Cretaceous period. They showed up millions of years earlier in the Jurassic. That's mainly just a minor nitpick, but it would have been really cool to see. Now, how about this Longipteryx design? How cool does this look? Yes, I'm biased because I love kingfishers. The coloration is just really nice. The blues with the, kind of brownish orange coloration. It's very nice. The design overall, the model looks really good. It has the teeth at the front of the beak. It's a solid design. I really like it. So they chase down the Guaidraco and, kind of like again, thematically, it establishes that dinosaurs have started to move into the skies as you have more and more dinosaurs become more and more adaptable at flying. There's just a lot of things like that, scattered throughout the whole documentary. Then we see a stegosaur, which is interesting because we are in the Cretaceous period. My guess is that this is Wuherosaurus, which is an early Cretaceous stegosaurid. Now, of course, Stegosauridae, they were mostly going extinct towards the end of the Jurassic period. And then they are very few and far between in the early Cretaceous period. At the very least, we haven't found a lot of evidence of their existence there. To help establish that, they're showcasing some plants that are becoming a little bit more defensible, like they're getting spikes and they're getting poison and all of that good stuff, which is making it a little bit more difficult for stegosaurs to eat, I guess. It was likely of a few different reasons why stegosaurs went extinct, like with most animals over the course of Earth's history, and rather wasn't just like a singular thing, how it's portrayed right here. From that point, it's kind of implied that Stegosauridae is, starting to go extinct, if not is already extinct, which is very similar to the whole basal sauropodomorph thing that I talked about in the last episode, where they establish a creature that's doing well in the episode prior, and then you show that animal struggling and getting replaced by another creature. In this case, stegosaurs were established in the late Jurassic, at the end of the Jurassic episode, and then in the early Cretaceous episode, it's being shown that they're going extinct, and then we get introduced to an ankylosaur. So that's likely showcasing the fact that ankylosaurs sort of filled the niche that stegosaurs once filled. Now, ankylosaurs, they are a part of the same group as stegosaurs, that being Thyreophora, and one of the suspected reasons why stegosaurs went extinct is because of ankylosaurs. They Uh, as stegosaurs became less and less prominent, ankylosaurs started to show up a little bit more in the fossil record, which implies that they were becoming a little bit more dominant in that particular niche and therefore replaced most of the stegosaurs. It's even mentioned in the episode that the ankylosaur that we're introduced to is a little bit more efficient at eating, which again links to the idea that they sort of replaced the stegosaurs, I guess. Now, this ankylosaur is not given a name, but I'm sure that there's a plethora of different names that you can assign to it. It does seem like a notosaur to me, but it is still an ankylosaurian. We're introduced to it while it's swimming, which is a very fun idea that I don't think we've really seen in any sort of documentary before. This idea is certainly not new. I've seen quite a bit of paleo art out there depicting an ankylosaur acting like a hippo, like walking around the floor of a body of water and eating that water vegetation. I don't know if we have any substantial evidence to help support it per se, but it's always really fun to see, and I thought it was really cool to see it right here. Kind of gives it a really interesting, different angle that we've seldom ever seen on a documentary before. I love its design too. Like, I love the skeletal structure, I love the way that the osteoderms look, and I especially love the coloration. Now, as we find out later in the episode or in this segment, that coloration is directly linked to sexual dimorphism. It's extremely bright red, especially in the throat, which is contrasted heavily to the female that we get introduced to, who has more so some duller coloration. We also get to hear the ankylosaur sing, which was just really cool, the way that it echoes throughout the valley. And they just showcase like a few different dinosaurs looking in the distance. Like, what is that? I really like the sounds that the ankylosaur made, and yeah, it was just a nice section. Then we go to Hatseg Island, which is likely going to be the highlight for a lot of people in this episode. So obviously, as you can probably expect, we get introduced to some dwarf dinosaurs, specifically Magyarosaurus, which is a dwarf sauropod that inhabited the island. Now, I could be wrong with this, but I do think that they're undersized in this episode. Now, yes, Magyarosaurus was small, but I don't think it was quite this small. Now, they could just be younger individuals, but I don't think that was ever specified. I mean, Morgan Freeman did mention that one of them was younger than the others, and therefore that one was like a prime target, but I don't know if it's really implied that the rest of the Magyarosaurs are younger. Again, I could be wrong. This could be an accurate size for Magyarosaurus, but this does seem a little bit too small. And the reason why I think that is because Hatzegopteryx shows up. Of course, you can't have Hatzeg Island without the dominant predatory animal of that island, that being Hatzegopteryx. And when it shows up, Magyarosaurus, like it like towers over Magyarosaurus. And I don't think Hatzegopteryx was too much taller than Magyarosaurus was. Now, let's talk about this Hatzegopteryx because what a design. I really liked it. Like, it's it's really bulky in the beak. It's pretty bulky in the throat, which is like a traditional Hatzegopteryx depiction. But then you also have like some really interesting soft tissue that's kind of turkey-like in a way, that covers its face, which was awesome. I don't think I've ever seen something like that in a documentary before for a Hatzegopteryx. Obviously, it's completely speculative, but most of Hatzegopteryx is speculative anyway, because it's known from very fragmentary remains. So I loved it. I loved this design. I thought it was really incredible. I also loved seeing it in like the fog, because it was foggy. Of course, it was all lit and shot like a horror film, where these poor little Magyarosaurs are being attacked and stalked by a giant giraffe-sized pterosaur. So the way that it was kind of mostly shrouded by the fog was really nicely done, and the way that it was running around chasing these Magyarosaurs was also really well done. That is a fantastic way to portray Hatzegopteryx, or giant Asdarchids in general, because they would be pretty terrifying animals to see in real life. So I did really like this section as well. It was a pretty nice section. Again, I think that there might be some inaccuracies present, but overall pretty nice. Then the big part of the episode. Old Spinosaurus aegypticus. I gotta say, I loved its reveal. Watching it walk out of the trees in that sort of like mangrove environment was so cool. It was so cool. Now, the narration does mention that Spinosaurus is the largest predator to ever walk the earth. And, it depends on what you consider largest. It depends on that. Spinosaurus is certainly the longest that we know of, and it's potentially one of the tallest, but in terms of overall mass, which is weight, it is not. Like, T-Rex does surpass it in that department, so does Giganotosaurus, I believe. But really, we don't know for sure because Spinosaurus is still an incredibly fragmentary dinosaur. The reason why we have a better idea of how much T-Rex weighed, for example, is because we have a lot of T-Rex specimens. Maybe if we find more Spinosaurus specimens, maybe it'll turn out that Spinosaurus was a lot heavier than we initially thought, but only time will tell with that. Just right now, it doesn't seem like it was quite the largest in terms of overall mass. Again, if you consider largest like height or length, then yeah, Spinosaurus is certainly among the largest at the very least. But if you're looking at overall mass, then no. But this Spinosaurus design is really good. I really, really liked the way that this Spinosaurus looked. I really like the shape of the sail. It's got like the half circle, which you don't see too frequently in media depictions anymore. Now, any shape for the sail is valid. You know, we don't know exactly what shape that sail had in life, but it does seem like a half circle is a bit more likely than, say, the notch that you see in a lot of media depictions. And the reason for that is because, there's been quite a few sailed animals throughout history, and a lot of them have more complete sails than Spinosaurus. And it more often than not, you have like a half circle. And so because it's so common in nature with all of the sails that we see, it makes it a bit more likely that Spinosaurus had a half circle. But again, we just don't know for sure. So either depiction is fine. I'm not trying to start arguments here. I can already hear the comments, or I could see the comments in my mind. They haunt me in my dreams. We don't know for sure. A notch is valid. A flat sail is valid, and a half circle is valid. I'm not saying that any is invalid. All right, but the proportions look really good. It has a long neck. The snout shape looks good. They gave it oral tissue, and the tail looks really good as well. In a lot of ways, this looks like a way that like Mark Whitten would draw Spinosaurus, so I wouldn't be surprised if maybe he was attached to it. Now, let's talk about the big one, the controversial part of Spinosaurus, the swimming, the behaviors, the way that it would actually catch its fish. Now, obviously, there's been a lot of back and forth over the years about how Spinosaurus would get its fish. There are many experts out there who believe that Spinosaurus was capable of diving and then chasing after its fish like that. And then there are experts who believe that Spinosaurus kind of stuck to shallow waters and caught fish like that, a little bit more like a giant heron, like a hell heron, as it's often been called, or heron from hell. Now, it does seem like there's a lot of substantial evidence that helps support the idea that it was kind of like sticking to shallow waters. It was noted that Spinosaurus has relatively dense bones. However, the exact density has been called into question, so we're not too certain about that. It was also noted that its tail was a lot like a paddle, but later analysis found that it wouldn't have been too effective at propelling the animal forward. Plus, Spinosaurus did have a series of air sacs that traveled throughout its skeleton, which would make it a little bit more buoyant than it would want to be if it was a diving animal. And of course, there is that sail. Now, for some reason, a lot of people think that that sail would help it swim, but actually, it seems like it would have caused a lot of drag. See, because that sail wasn't flexible, it was a huge, solid object. So even like the front of the sail would have created a huge surface area that would have caused a lot of drag. Spinosaurus would have to spend a lot of energy just to try to push itself forward in the water fast enough to even catch even big fish would have been faster than it. So that doesn't really seem like an effective way to hunt. Now, obviously, we don't know for sure. Again, I'm not saying that we know for sure, and more fossil discoveries could paint a different picture, but that's what seems likely right now. And that's what's portrayed in the dinosaurs. This Spinosaurus goes to shallow waters and it simply waits for fish to come by. But the way that it waits was really interesting, and I've never seen something like this done before for a Spinosaurus. It catches a small fish, drops it in the water, and then waits. It set a trap. It set up some bait and essentially set up a trap. And then it placed the tip of its snout into the water, because it's likely that Spinosaurus had pressure sensors in the tip of its snout, which could detect movement in the water, while keeping its high raised nostrils out of the water. And it waited for a shark to come by because the shark would pick up the blood from the fish that it just caught. Now, obviously, this behavior is entirely speculative. Like, was Spinosaurus capable of setting traps? I don't know. It's difficult to say. Obviously, some modern day dinosaurs do that, but it's hard to say if, a non-avian dinosaur would do that if we can't observe it doing that. So, yeah, purely speculative, but it was certainly really fun to see and not something that was ever on my bingo card. So, anyway, it waits with its snout in the water. A pterosaur lands on its sail, which was really funny because it's like shaking its sail to try to get it off. It was a very funny moment. And then a shark shows up and then it snatches it out of the water. Very nice segment. I really liked it. I thought it was interesting. I thought it was a different way to portray Spinosaurus. And we've been getting a lot of different Spinosaurus portrayals recently, so it was cool. I liked it. And again, before anything starts in my comments, again, things might change with future fossil discoveries of Spinosaurus. Just keep that in mind. So yeah, that was pretty much episode 3 of the dinosaurs. Next up is episode 4, which is continuing on the late Cretaceous. Obviously, Spinosaurus lived in the late Cretaceous, but it lived in like the earlier part of the late Cretaceous. The next episode is like going later into that. That will be the finale. And then, of course, I will release a full review of the show. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And that's pretty much all I have for this one. Thank you guys so much for watching and have an awesome day.